Could I say thank you all for being here today. It's really great to be in this wonderful theatre, which I've been in before, and is such a great place and in such a great town. And I thank Thelma for coming today to introduce the event. Thelma won her seat in Colne Valley in the general election, and we had an incredible rally on a beautiful summer's evening in a park, and it was just that buzz and that atmosphere that she'd inspired, because a real head teacher doesn't threaten, a real head teacher inspires their students, and that's exactly what Thelma does in her constituency and in Parliament. And so we've got a head teacher chairing the event, so anybody that gets a bit unruly, she'll talk to you quietly and privately afterwards and sort it out. And I want to also say it's great to be here alongside my great friend Pete Chowney, our candidate, and is going to be our MP for Hastings. Pete, as our candidate, took it so close. Pete, as our candidate, is also the leader of the council. Pete really is actually Mr. Hastings. Well done, Pete. And his concern and his determination to turn this town around so that the levels of poverty that do disfigure so many South Coast towns will be dealt with, that the sense of hopelessness that so many face when they see towns declining because of lack of investment, underfunding of their local services by central government, and a whole process of threats to local services such as the National Health Service, have got to be stopped, challenged and changed. And it's Labour that will stop, challenge and change the way in which so many of our South Coast towns are affected. And this, of course, is the town that inspired the writing of The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropist. And Mugsborough, as it's described there, was about the inequality and injustice within our society then and now, and the way in which those building workers were exploited, the way in which the poor were ignored, that social segregation that was there in the town. That's what inspired Robert Tressel Noonan to write his wonderful book. It's a book that inspired me and inspired generations of people to look at the world differently, from a perspective that brings about social justice, that brings about equality, that brings about hope for all. It's called socialism. And I would like to thank and welcome my colleagues here today who've come. Diane Abbott, our Shadow Home Secretary, who actually, I think, was quite looking forward to debates with Amber Rudd, but she's gone on to do something else, and I'll deal with universal credit a bit later on. But Diane is doing a fantastic job in bringing humanity to the whole principles behind the Home Affairs brief and promoting justice and equality. And you'll hear lots from her tonight when she's on BBC Question Time. Diane, thank you and thanks for coming. And Richard Bergen, our Shadow Secretary of State for Justice, is also here today, who is taking the issue of justice reform and prison reform and justice to our society straight out there to the public and in that debate, and he's doing an incredible job around the Shadow Cabinet table. Richard, thank you very much for everything that you do. Yesterday, the Prime Minister suffered the most devastating defeat in Parliament on the most important issue facing our country. The central policy of her government has been decisively rejected. The defeat that she suffered in the vote on the European Union agreement that she had reached was the biggest ever defeat any government has ever faced in British political history. Think about that, the biggest ever defeat on a central plank of it. It's clear that her EU deal is now finished. There can be no question of tweaks or sweeteners from Brussels to bring it back to life. The deal that she brought back, all the 500 plus pages of it, is quite clearly a dead deal. She put it to Parliament and it was emphatically rejected. And we now have to realise that the Prime Minister seems completely unable to grasp what has actually happened. She seems to be prepared to send the country hurtling towards a cliff edge. To get a deal that can command a majority in Parliament, Theresa May has to ditch the red lines and get serious about proposals for the future. Last night's offer of talks with party leaders turned out to be simply a stunt, not a serious attempt to engage with a new reality that is needed. No sooner had she said the words in Parliament than the government confirmed that she would not take no deal off the table. So I say to the Prime Minister again, I'm quite happy to talk, but the starting point for any talks about Brexit must be that the threat of a disastrous no-deal outcome is ruled out, taken off the table, and we can talk about the future of the plans that we will put forward and the future relationship with Europe. But take no deal off the table now, please, Prime Minister. And if she won't accept the will of Parliament to take no deal off the table, it will show that she simply isn't serious about reaching a deal. With no deal on the table, the Prime Minister would enter into phony talks just to run down the clock and try to blackmail MPs to vote through her botched deal on a second attempt by threatening the country with the chaos that no deal would bring if they resist her entreaties to support her deal a second time. Instead, Theresa May should show us that she's serious about getting a deal that Parliament supports and that brings the country together by immediately ending the waste of hundreds of millions of pounds of public money preparing for a no-deal outcome which simply cannot take place. The government has set aside £4.8 billion to prepare for no deal. There's so many better things that money could be spent on. Instead, could support our cash-starved public services. £4.8 billion would pay for every 2 to 4-year-old to get free nursery education for a year. £4.8 billion would help the crisis of social care and funding in our NHS. £4.8 billion would help the crisis of rough sleeping homelessness. £4.8 billion could do so much for youth services in young people around our country. But no, the government is prepared to spend £4.8 billion of our money on preparing for a no-deal Brexit in order to try and threaten MPs into voting for her deal, which has already been declared bankrupt by Parliament itself. Prime Minister, take it off the table and have a serious discussion about how we approach the future. No deal would risk huge damage to our economy, jobs and living standards. About that, there is no doubt. So Labour is open to discussions because we must end the crisis caused by the government's botched Brexit negotiations and find a solution that meets the needs of the whole country. We, the Labour Party, have set out an alternative plan, and I've made clear we would support a deal on that basis. The government may have survived a confidence vote for now, but we have a government in name only. The scale of the defeat on Tuesday has shredded the last vestiges of its authority. If the government had any confidence in itself, it would go back to the people for a new mandate. While Brexit consumes all the government's energy, the vital issues that affect people most directly, cash-starved schools, the NHS at breaking point, rising bills, unaffordable houses, have all gone to the back of the queue. 2.5 years of Brexit bungling and failure have left Parliament in deadlock. Nothing can be decided, nothing can get done. We believe that the best outcome for this crisis, for the country as a whole, remains calling a general election to break the deadlock and find a solution that works for the whole country. And that is why I tabled a motion of no confidence last night, and I thank all those colleagues that supported the motion of no confidence last night. And we will come back on it again if necessary, because we are determined to deal with the issues facing this country and also give the people a choice of who their MPs should be and who their government should be, whether they have one that stands up for them or one that shows the degree of incompetence that this government has shown. But in the meantime, all options are on the table. We're serious about finding a way through. Given the severity of the crisis, it would be wrong to rule any of them out. Our first option is the alternative plan we've laid out over the past year. Labour will put down its own amendment to the proposals next week, setting out our alternative plan, based around a permanent customs union with the European Union, a strong single market relationship, and a guarantee at least to keep pace with all EU rights at work, environmental protections and consumer standards. We will not take part or allow this country to become part of a race to the bottom in which the poorest and most vulnerable lose out in order to appease the very richest and the biggest corporations in the world. No. We want to see a protection for the most vulnerable within our society. Those three elements provide the essential building blocks of a sensible deal, with a clear potential to win the majority support in Parliament. And I believe such a deal would help to bring people together and overcome the divisions in our country. But if the government remains intransigent, if support for Labour's alternative is blocked for party advantage and the country is facing the potential disaster of no deal, our duty will then be to look at other options which we set out in our conference motion, including that of a public vote. We are in this position because the Conservatives and other parties have deliberately chosen to deepen divisions, setting those who voted leave against those who voted to remain. People voted leave, people voted remain. But we are the party that has consistently sought to bring people together to find a way through that respects people's concern, whichever way they voted in the referendum. Because I believe the real divide in our country is not between Leave and Remain voters. It's between the many who do the work, create the wealth, pay their taxes, work in our society, work in our hospitals, work in our schools, work in our factories, deliver the economy and the living standards for the rest of us. And those others, those few, who break the rules, who dodge their taxes, who run away and don't support our society and our economy. It's between the many and the few. Labour set out in our manifesto in 2017 the plans we have for an investment-led economy, for good jobs, for a higher basic wage, for an investment in education, in housing and health, and all those issues. We set all that out because we believe that's the direction in which the majority of people in this country want to go. But on Tuesday, while the country's attention was fixed on Westminster and the vote that took place, and it was a dramatic day in Parliament. I'd never seen such chaos in any government, and I've been in Parliament 35 years, and I've seen plenty of chaos in government, but that was the worst by a long way. We had yet another demonstration of the harsh reality of what this government is about. The Department of Work and Pensions, and the MP for Hastings and Rye is indeed the Secretary of State for the Department of Work and Pensions, quietly decided to announce another cut to social security, which, according to analysis done by Age UK, could leave some couples up to £7,000 a year worse off. Their latest cut will force yet more people onto the government's cruel universal credit scheme. Couples in which one spouse is a pensioner will no longer be entitled to pension credit. So just imagine this. If you've paid into the system all your life and you've retired on a low income, and now the government decides you'll be poorer just because your partner is younger than you. That's disgraceful, that's wrong, and that was announced on Tuesday while the rest of the nation was watching Parliament and what was going on there. How typical of the Tories, how typical of Amber Rudd. Whether they voted Leave or Remain, people want an end to these injustices. Remember, the vast majority of people don't think of themselves as Remainers or Leavers. However, they're regarded by the media as somehow or other a political class that's got to be negotiated around. If we allow ourselves to be permanently divided on these artificial lines, it's only the privileged elite that will benefit, while the majority lose out. So, our message to the government is, you've lost your vote in Parliament, you survived yesterday on the loyalty, the rather thin loyalty of Tory MPs, and we are determined to get a deal with the European Union, which, as I've explained, sets out the 3 pillars that we will put forward. We are sensible, we're serious, and we're positive about this. But our entire focus as a party is on the reality of people's lives in this country. The poverty, the insecurity, the lack of investment, the concerns and fears for the future. Bring people together to create that better society and that better world. Have that relationship with Europe that gives us the customs union, gives us the trade, protects the rights. Have that relationship that is positive, that is open. I want to live in a country that doesn't rely on food banks, that doesn't rely on payday loans, that doesn't rely on loan sharks. I want to live in a country where people feel engaged, enthused, and positive for the future. That is the Labour way, and that will be the forefront of our minds during the next few weeks of crucial debate and voting in Parliament. Deliver a society that works for all, not just the few. Thank you very much. Okay.
Well, we did think that Jeremy Corbyn was going to take some questions, which is why we are staying on these pictures, but it doesn't look like he is going to. He said that Theresa May is sending the country hurtling towards a cliff edge and she needs to ditch her red lines. That last night's talks were simply a stunt, in his words. He said that what's happened in the last 48 hours or so in Parliament, it means the government is a government in name only. It has shredded its last vestiges of its authority. And he says that we should go back to the country now for a new mandate, but it's not a second referendum that he is calling for. He is calling for a general election. Well, let's cross to our political correspondent, Kate McCann, who is outside number 10 for us. It certainly seems clear from there that he doesn't seem in any way minded to join the rounds of talks that Theresa May is having with other political leaders.
Well, that's right. If it's chilly here in Downing Street, the atmosphere between the Prime Minister and Jeremy Corbyn is certainly chillier. He called her bid to have talks with him, which she made last night in the House of Commons, a stunt. He said that he won't have any conversations with her until she categorically rules out a no-deal Brexit. And he also accused the government of wasting £4.8 billion on no-deal planning. He said that that money could be much better used for lots of other things. He accused the government of trying to push MPs to back her deal by wasting all of this money in a bid to force them into backing Theresa May's plan when they don't want to do that. And he also, probably the most notable thing Mr Corbyn did in that speech, was he said again that he could bring back no confidence votes in the government against Theresa May again and again and again. Now, clearly the Prime Minister won that vote yesterday with strength of support from her Conservative MPs and the DUP. But the Labour leader is making a calculation. He thinks if he keeps bringing those votes as things get more difficult for the Prime Minister as she tries to find a way forward on Brexit, that he could have more chance of winning it. And of course, Jeremy Corbyn wants to see a general election. He reiterated it again there in that speech. He said that a general election would be the best way forward. There are other options on the table. He named a public vote as one of those. Now, there are around 71 Labour MPs in his party came out yesterday campaigning for him to adopt that as Labour's position. They want him to commit to a second EU referendum, go back to the people and ask that question again. But Mr Corbyn clearly not quite ready to do that. He's still saying that he wants to present Labour's plans for the way forward. He said that Labour would prefer a permanent customs union with the European Union and a close relationship on the single market. Now, that customs union question is an important one because that's one of the points that lots of MPs here in Parliament are currently coalescing around, whether there could be some movement on that issue. Now, Number 10 were very clear and have been consistently clear that a customs union with the European Union would mean the UK couldn't do independent trade deals, and that's Theresa May's priority in these talks with other MPs. She says that's effectively a red line for her. But Jeremy Corbyn saying that that's exactly what he wants to see, which already puts those two leaders in completely opposite positions. So if they are to hold talks here in Downing Street, and if those MPs from the Labour Party are to try and find a way forward with the Prime Minister, there's going to have to be some kind of compromise on that point. And that's actually something that some of her own cabinet ministers are pushing for too. We've seen a softening in that position from ministers like David Gauke and others who think that maybe the UK could try and find a compromise with the European Union on that point, which would allow these Brexit plans to go through the Commons with support from Labour MPs. Of course, there's the other wing of the Conservative Party, the hardline Brexiteers, who don't want anything like that at all. So lots of conversations yet to happen. Theresa May really has to bring everyone together, but Jeremy Corbyn making it very, very clear in that speech that he is not ready to talk to her until she rules out a no-deal Brexit.
OK, Kate, thanks very much for that. I think Jeremy Corbyn is taking questions down in Hastings. Just see if we can go back there to listen in.
The parliamentary process, and we agreed there would be 5 days of debate and there would be a vote on December the 11th. 2 days before that, she changed her mind, cancelled the vote and delayed things for over a month in order to continue this idea of running down the clock by threatening everyone with no deal unless they voted for her deal. Well, it didn't work because she ended up with the biggest ever defeat in British political history. And so I'm more than happy to put forward Labour's points of view, and indeed we will be doing that next week in Parliament. We will be putting forward our amendments, which will be around the issues that I've already referred to. And if we succeed in getting a general election, then obviously we will put to the people our views on this, our views on the kind of relationship we could have with Europe in the future. But I have to say, Labour is a very large, very open and very democratic party. Our policy going into the general election, our manifesto, will not be decided by me alone. I'll be one person in the room that will be deciding what goes in that manifesto. There will be many, many others there. And so our general election strategy will be that. But I think I've made it very clear the principles that we adopt, which is about the kind of society we want to live in, is about that relationship with Europe as a very minimal. But I've also said, made it very clear, that all the options are on the table, including the public vote option, which we made clear in our conference motion, which was, I have to remind you, unanimously agreed by our conference last September in Liverpool. And on the question of the exit date, quite clearly, if no agreement has been reached, within time that it could be implemented by the end of March, then obviously the issue of extending the exit date, of extending Article 50 does come into play, and indications are that may well be the case coming up after April. But our principles are, our views are there, we're prepared to negotiate. The Labour Party is in Parliament in order to try to defend people against the crisis that would be created by a no-deal Brexit, but also to put forward a positive relationship with the European Union in the future. That is what we've said all the way through this process. And I just have to say this, without the work of Labour MPs and those people that were prepared to go to court on it, and particularly the forensic work done by Keir Starmer on this, we would not have had the meaningful vote in Parliament, because the government introduced this whole process with a bill which I described yesterday in Parliament as one that Henry VIII would have been proud of, because what it did was actually empowered, I can't remember which Secretary of State for Brexit it was, because there's been so many of them, to decide everything, basically, and Parliament would just be a sort of bystander in this. Well, things have changed. Parliament rejected the idea of the Brexit deal Theresa May had negotiated, rejected the no-deal exit, and has ensured that Parliament will have a big say in what goes on over the next few weeks. That only happened because the Labour Party was standing up for the rights of democratically elected representatives to speak for them in Parliament and hold government to account. And I say that as somebody who obviously aspires to be in government, therefore to be Prime Minister. I would welcome being held to account by Parliament. I would not be running away from Parliament. I would want to be held to account for it. The questions of division and polarisation within our society are very, very, very serious ones indeed. We saw a whiff of it last week outside Parliament when Anna Soubry, Conservative MP, and Owen Jones were both abused and attacked and called all sorts of awful things. Some MPs get a great deal of abuse, and nobody has been more abused and more badly treated than our friend Diane Abbott, who worked as MP and as Shadow. She has had to withstand the most awful, misogynist and racist abuse all of her political life. But she's strong. She comes through this and makes the point. She takes it because she doesn't want anybody else have to take it. And so it is about the language we use. It is also about the intolerance that is there on the far right and on the racist fringes of our society. We saw some awful things happening just after the last referendum. I don't want to see any more of that. I don't want any anti-Semitism. I don't want Islamophobia. I don't want any far-right racism within our society. We have to come together as a society and a community. And when you raise the question of insecurity and the idea of vigilantism, well, vigilantism doesn't solve anything. What does deal with the issues of security within our society and bringing people together and having a sense of hope, having a police force that is adequately funded and is active and there on the streets. 20,000 police officers are no longer on the streets. And it was the last Labour government that introduced community policing, PCSOs, which I think have been a safe neighbourhood strategy. I think has been a very good one. But the way to reduce crime is a combination of things, including better quality.
Let's just move away from Jeremy Corbyn now and cross